אני מתכבדת להזמין
I'm honored to invite Dr. Amnon Cavari, the head of the Institute for Liberty and Responsibility and the Lab for Public Opinion Research at the Reichman University, to present the findings of the joint survey on how Israelis and Americans see the U.S.-Israeli relations. The survey was conducted both in the U.S. and in Israel. Dr. Cavari, please. So, hello everyone. During my talk today, I will present trends in American public opinion on Israel and then data from two polls we conducted this month in Israel and in the US that pertain specifically to the impact of the judiciary overhaul on American public opinion on Israelis, and how Israelis, on the other hand, view the relations between the two countries. Spoiler, and the results are definitely a source of concern. You probably could have guessed that on your own. American public opinion is more splintered, and it is characterized by the old guard, which is replaced by the new guard, which has a very critical attitude towards Israel. The American public attributes great importance to democratic values as a basis for the collaboration between the two countries, and they are expressing their doubt regarding the future of the special relations between the two countries if these values are harmed in the future. Now let's look at trends in American public opinion. In studies I've been conducting for 15 years now, I examine changes in American public opinion towards Israel, and the basis for that research is what you see on this slide, that American public opinion is important in order to understand the special relations between the two countries. As just a few minutes ago, the ambassador said there are various factors that impact the warm relations between the two countries. Some of them are strategic, some have to do with the special characteristics that each of these populations has. But obviously, strong support, as we have today, between Israel and the U.S., or from the U.S. towards Israel, that cannot exist if American public opinion will not be supportive. And if there's one thing, and there are a lot of things we need to understand about American politics, if there's one thing that we know for sure about American politics, is that the public elected officials are attentive to their constituency. It's part of the system, the fact that they have elections every 2 years, so it will be very difficult for publicly elected officials to act in contrast to their constituency or in contrast to their agenda. If the American public will see Israel as a political or economic burden, then it will be very difficult for the American people to continue to support Israel. It's enough if the constituency of one party, and I'm referring to the Democratic Party, will express doubts about this relationship. That's enough to undermine the relationship, and that will turn this as part of the political debate in the U.S. Research indicates an increase in the support for Israel. On the one hand, that's a good thing, but on the other hand, we can see some significant processes of the breakdown of the agreement regarding Israel, and we'll also try to see the impact of recent events. Well, first of all, we look at general attitudes. We look at two areas that we have consistent data over the past 2 or 3 decades, and these are based on annual polls conducted by Gallup. The first series is comprised of 2 separate questions, and in each one they ask the general population a separate question: to what extent do they support, or to what extent do they view favorably the two political entities in our region, in our area, Israel and the Palestinian Authority? There's an increase in sympathy for both entities, a clear tendency, but a clear preference of Israel over the Palestinian Authority. The second series, and it's too simple. Sometimes they say, I like both the same way. I mean, I don't pay any price if I say that I prefer Israel or the PA. So we like to use another series of questions, which also has quite a few issues. And in this question, we ask, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we ask the American population to choose between these two children, so to speak, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Here as well, one can see a very clear preference for Israelis, but the trends are much more radical. We see how the groups are growing closer, a drop in the sympathy for Israelis at the expense of an increase in sympathy for Palestinians, and still twice as much sympathy for Israelis in comparison to Palestinians. Okay, so we could have finished with that, and we could have said, okay, things are pretty good. But the story is a bit different, of course. Let's break it apart and look at the political distribution or breakdown. First of all, the tendency of the two major political groups, and for our purposes, I'm going to set aside those who are non-affiliated politically, so I am looking only at public opinion. I'm not talking about public elected officials, I'm only talking about public opinion. Regarding sympathy for Israel or favorability to Israel, we see a difference between the Democrats, that's the blue, and the Republicans in red. The Republicans have greater sympathy for Israel than the Democrats, and with respect to the Palestinians, there's even a greater difference. We see that the Republicans maintain a relatively low level of support for Palestinians, and whilst with the Democrats we see a significant increase, and this brings them close almost to the levels of support for Israelis. And this is a question that is asked separately regarding Israel and regarding the Palestinian Authority. But what about the question that forces them to choose in this question, the question of the sympathies in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Whom do you support more? And then you have to choose. Regarding this question, we can all of a sudden see the difference. These trends receive increased support, and the difference between Republicans and Democrats here is obvious. We see that the Republicans very clearly, you can see the red on the left and the red on the right. On the left side, you can see that this is Israel. On the right-hand side, it's the Palestinians, and you can see how very clearly support for Israel and very low level of support for the Palestinians. Among the Democrats, you can see the significant drop in support for Israelis and a significant increase in Palestinian support. And one can see that in another way. Let's see the comparison. We can look at it in another way. On the left side, it's the Democrats' support for Israelis in comparison to Palestinians. You can see that they are more in favor of Palestinians than Democrats, and the Republicans very, very clearly prefer Israelis over Palestinians. Now, I mean, the situation is even more complicated than that. Beyond the political division, we have a very big gap when we look at, when we divide it up by generations. Let's go back to the sympathies slide. We can see the gradual increase in support for Palestinians and a slight drop for sympathy for Israelis. But let's think about it more as a gap. We can see that the gap minimizes the more we go down, it's the red line, and beneath that is increased support for or sympathy for Palestinians. At the upper part, it's a support for Israeli. That's a comparison. But we can see that there's a convergence towards the Palestinians. That's the overall population, the general populations. Now let's divide it according to generations. When I divide it according to generational groups, and here you can see 4 different generations. One generation is, we call it the oldest generation, those who were born at the beginning of the 20th century until the World War II. That's the silent generation. And then the baby boomers born in the 40s and the 1940s and 1950s. Then those who were born in the 60s and 70s, that's the X generation. And then finally the millennials. And we can see that the younger the generation, the support for Israel is lower. Not only that, let's see what happens to the youngest generation, a significant drop in support for Israel. And why is that important? Well, for 2 reasons. First of all, a generation in a public opinion survey is critical. Why is it critical? Because the more we understand today the shaping of opinions in public opinion, we understand that the things that impact us in our political adult or maturation or puberty years, that's the 20s. So you see why there is this fixed difference, and this means that the younger generations that are less supportive of Israel today will continue to be less supportive of Israel further down the line. That's the first reason. And the second reason is clear to us all, and that is the demographic change that we see here, because ultimately the older generations are being replaced by the younger generations, and the younger generations are going to be the majority of the American society, and this majority is less supportive of Israel. If we look ahead, things don't look so good. But that means that we have to try and understand how today's events affect public opinion. So we did hold this survey, and we did check. We checked what do Americans think need to be the main considerations in their decision whether to establish and maintain good relations or alliances with other countries, considerations for maintaining a special relationship with other countries. So we asked them about strategic considerations, business interests. We also asked them about shared democratic values and shared religious values. So as you can see quite clearly, the first two, strategic considerations and business interests, receive a high percentage, but look, democratic values almost to the same extent. 80% of the American population thinks that this is a significant consideration in establishing and maintaining special relationships. The Americans think that the importance of U.S.-Israeli relations on the scale of not at all important to extremely important, most Americans are somewhere towards the middle and moderately important. The Democrats a bit less than that, the Republicans a bit more than that, but they think that there is great importance to the relations between the two countries. But this set of considerations regarding the importance of the relationship between the countries, does it also apply to Israel? Yes. When we ask them, why is it important, they say, because it's an ally, because Israel is our ally. They also say because Israel is a strategic asset, and they also say because Israel is a democracy, and the shared democratic values are in common for both countries. So it's not just because they think that Israel is the Holy Land. It is important for quite a few Americans, 50% of the Americans, but a lot of people think that this consideration, the fact that Israel is a democracy, is significant. Well, if that's the case, what do they think about what's happening now? This is a sentence we referred to earlier in our conversation with the ambassador. Is it legitimate for the U.S. to criticize what's happening in Israel? We asked the Americans about that. 60% of the Americans say that it is legitimate, 70% of Democrats, and almost half of the Republicans. So that means the American population thinks that it is legitimate to critique when the situation in Israel conflicts with American values. They stand behind their values and they say, if you deviate from these values, we should say something. So, yes, we do need to critique, to refer to. And what about the current situation? We asked about three things that are on the agenda to this or to that extent. One is the judicial overhaul. The second is the threat over freedom of press. And the third is the change of religious status in Israel. On each of these issues, over half of the American population thinks that these are things that they should critique Israel for. And even when we divide it up between Republicans and Democrats, we can see that definitely the Democrats think that Israel should be critiqued, but also half of the Republicans. It's not such an exception among Republicans as well. They think that they should criticize, and freedom of the press, in contrast to that comment on shutting down channels 11, 12, and 13, freedom of the press. Even among Republicans, over 50% think that if there's a change regarding freedom of the press, then Israel should be critiqued for that. Let's understand the meaning of all this. Should we reevaluate the relations? Should we reevaluate, reassess the strength of the relations if these things are passed? Yes, especially among Democrats, but also among quite a few Republicans. So if I'll sum sum up the American part of this situation, then yes, Americans do think that the relationship is important, but that our democratic values are also important, and we must address them when we think about this relationship. And now let's look at public opinion in Israel, and this part is actually going to be a bit shorter. So first of all, we asked the Israelis, a poll that was held at the exact same time this month, we asked Israelis, to what extent do you think that we should affiliate ourselves with democratic countries, or we should affiliate with countries based on our interests? Because one would think that our interest is the most important thing. China is important, let's establish a relationship with China. Another country is important, let's establish a relationship with them. We should think about our interests and not on whether or not that country is democratic. Well, 80% of Israelis think that it's important to be affiliated with democratic countries. What about the U.S. and other important allies? The Israelis think that the U.S. is an important ally. That's 90%, a 7% increase than the situation 2 years ago when we held this survey. Russia, now it's 15%. Before the war, it was 40%, and China also has a low level. So Israelis think that the U.S. is an important ally, but are they willing to take the significance, this importance, and for it to impact how they consider the U.S., or to what extent are they willing to accept the U.S. criticism and view? Well, that's a bit more complicated. We asked them, should Israel consider the U.S. opinion on various issues? For example, Israel's relations with Arab countries, Israel's building of settlements in Judea and Samaria, Israel's military activities in Judea and Samaria, etc. And we see how ultimately Israelis are kind of swaying. They're a bit more willing with the Arab countries, a bit less with respect to military activities, but by and large, about 50% are willing to accept this criticism. Obviously, the opposition wants more of it, and the opposition wants less of it. That makes sense. But what about the judicial overall? Is it indeed legitimate to critique? 51% say that it is. Very few among the coalition voters, and that means that when Minister Shikli says, mind your own business, who is he speaking to? He's speaking to his voters, his constituency. Is that going to hurt the special relations? Well, the Israelis are saying yes. Has it already harmed the special relations? When we asked this question, whether the relations between Israel and the U.S. have they escalated? Well, this is what the Israeli population thinks. In August of 2022, the Israelis didn't think so, but today Israelis do think so. Today, about 60% of Israelis think that yes, there is it is deteriorating, and who's responsible for that? If a few months ago, in August, they said, Israel, the U.S., they can be equally blamed, but today, quite clearly, Israel is responsible for the harm caused to the relationship between Israel and the U.S. I know that I've run out of time, but let me quickly conclude what are the main takeaways. Americans have a favorable view of Israel. That's encouraging, but generational changes and political trends can indicate a stark drop in support for Israel. The Americans attribute great support to Israel democratic values, and they're willing to criticize Israel if Israel undermines these. And they are also willing to reconsider the alliance. But Israelis acknowledge that Israelis view the U.S. as an important and strong ally, but they're saying we're willing only a little bit to accept the criticism, and we know that it could significantly harm the relationship between these two countries. Thank you very much.